how to manage engineering teams at scale. And with his vast experience in the area, I'm really excited to hear what we learn today. Before we start, for those of you that are new to our events, just a quick introduction. Adiva is a remote network of tech professionals. Our vision is to enable work without boundaries, and with these events to enable learning without boundaries. So anyone, anywhere, to be able to learn from leading experts like Andy today, and understand how the large companies or the exciting companies are doing engineering. We have Slido for the questions. The link will be shared in the chat in the comments. So make sure to ask your questions there. At the end of the session, we will go through all of them and try to answer as many as possible. And yeah, without further ado, Andy, welcome and thank you for accepting our invite.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with a quick introduction. Like, tell us a bit about yourself and what led you to this point of your career where you can share this with us.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, look, I identify as an engineer still. I like to build things. I like to build things with teams now. Spent more than 25 years kind of being a software engineer and being a software engineering leader in various capacities. Startups mostly. Although, you know, how to manage teams at scale, it's really how to manage them through the journey of like small through scale, or joining them at 15 or 20 and trying to scale them up to the next stage. You know, first company startup I was in, I joined as a engineer. I think we were about 30 and we sold that one. It was back in 1997. So it's quite a while ago. I found myself leading that team towards the end, and we were acquired by some microsystems. And that gave me my first taste really of working in a larger company with a larger team. Suddenly I had a team which was spread over 3 different countries, still about 40 people. So not a massive team, but that generated a bunch of interesting challenges for me. Was there for a little while, realized that I just preferred the kind of energy and the impact that I could have in smaller companies. So went on a roller coaster really of smaller companies after that. So Beat That Quote was a financial price comparison. I like to always do different market areas every time I go somewhere. Same founder as the original company. He'd invited me back right at the beginning of that company. So I was able to be part of that journey from pretty much the beginning, to build the engineering team and build the product from the ground up, which we did over a period of probably about 5 years, before we were then acquired by Google for that product. I spent 3 years in Google, integrating the team that had been acquired, my team there, which was about 25 at that point, growing it within London to about 35 or 40, supervising and kind of advising a parallel team in the US who were trying to build a parallel set of products in the US and integrating all of this into Google Search for various financial product comparisons. Again, had a really great time at Google, but it's still a large company. So I kind of packed up and said goodbye there after about 3.5 years, and went on and joined a company called Yieldify, which was actually first of the Google venture investments actually in Europe, which was a company that just had a Series A. They had about 30 people. My brief as joining that was, can we scale up to 100 with this new money that we've got? And yeah, that's a theme that you'll hear quite often. Everyone wants to get to 100 people. Just for the record, we didn't get to 100 people before I left or at any point. So then I was there for about 18 months. We rebuilt both the product and the team. So I started with 30 and we ended with 30. I think there was only about 27 of the original, 27 were new people. So we had to kind of rotate the team out and hire back in again. Re-platformed and kind of delivered a SaaS product for them as well. I left there, spent a couple of years working on my own startup with my wife, who's a product director from Google and at other points in my life. We got to a kind of seed round of financing for that. But we never managed to get the commercial traction. So it actually runs today. We have a couple of large customers who it runs for consistently, but it's not been my focus for some time. And that was very small. The engineering team there really only got to about 5. And it was a mixture of contractors and people who were working part-time and me and others. So it was a very scrappy kind of startup process. And that really led me to the most recent one, which is H4. I think when I joined there a couple of years ago, it was 30. It peaked in the team at about 70. And after that, engaged in a bunch of consultancies that I do, which gives me this really interesting view into lots of different companies who are generally at a kind of smaller stage, anywhere between 20 and 40. I have a relationship with an investor, and they contact me and say, hey, can you maybe come and give some opinions on how this is working and why, and I give some recommendations. So yeah, I've definitely seen some interesting ways in which teams make their lives difficult, which is good.
What are some of your favorite ones? Ways that engineers make their lives difficult?
Well, that's a whole topic on its own. I think the most interesting one I got to is I arrived at a team that had a set of teams actually who were building things. I had a dedicated team of people who were finishing things. There was a team called the finishing team, and then there was a team called the fix it team. And this was really an expression of the fact that the original teams who delivered it either didn't have time, didn't know what they were doing, didn't manage to get it finished, and were pushed onto something else. And so, but they realized they were getting a lot of pressure from their customer to finish some of these features. And then when they finished them, they weren't at high enough quality because they bounced them around through different teams and different people, and then they needed to fix them. So it was an interesting organizational structure.
I've been working with a team like that as well. They call them bug slayers.
Yeah, as a temporary kind of ninja squad to go and fix stuff, I'm okay with that. But as a permanent team with an actual name and a purpose, I don't see it working very well.
So you've been through funding and joining startups at different stages. What are the main challenges in terms of organizing teams, managing engineers that you've faced with?
I mean, look, I think the main challenge is really, I mean, the number one is people, right? Like at every stage of this, you need great people. Finding those people is difficult. It gets more difficult day on day, as the number of companies are challenging, for the skills. But what's interesting to observe, I think, is that you need different types of people at different stages. That small team culture where you're maybe up to 5 or 6 people, particularly when you're founding a company, usually 1 or 2 of those are people that you know, because everyone's not really getting paid, and you're kind of working to try and get something to happen. You're looking for people there really that are kind of jack of all trades. They can do lots of things. They're not really afraid to dig in where there are problems and try and make things as good as they can, as best as they can, even if they've never done those things before. I think as you scale up, some of those people adapt very well to essentially having a slightly more defined role, rather than this broad role where they can kind of dip in and out of lots of different things. And some don't. And some people either don't like it or don't like to admit to themselves they don't want to be part of a larger team, and it sometimes causes some issues. So I think people at that stage are important. And when you get to a larger team, you have to have more structure, and there has to be slightly more defined boundaries to your roles and who accepts responsibility for things. And so you're looking for that varied group rather than a collection of generalists. You're looking for a much more varied group with some specialized skills that help you fill the gaps and who work well together as a team. And keeping that balance as you grow is particularly difficult because, of course, you want all those people who've been with you since the beginning or the early days of your team. You want to offer them opportunities. You want to let them grow with you, right? You don't want to say, hey, well, I'm just going to hire them from the outside when I don't have what I want. And usually that works really well. But it becomes difficult when it's not working, actually, because you have this relationship with people, particularly when you started in a very small company, that makes it difficult to kind of manage them through that process and help them adapt and grow within the company, or in some cases help them understand that the company isn't the right place and it's not personal, it's just what we like to do. I think
I'm actually recognizing some of our issues in what you just described. When we were starting to grow.
Yeah. And I think people adapt and they evolve. And I think the other problem there is sometimes people bring experiences from other companies that worked really well in their past, and they try to just port them in. I guess we might touch on that a little bit more in detail later on, but not everything that works well in one place works well in another. It doesn't make it wrong in either place. It just means its context is everything. Right. I think another big problem that I see is, particularly as a team scales, is focus. Focus on what you're building, not necessarily how you build it, or although that too. But particularly when founders and non-technical founders and founding teams are trying to scale up, they want to do more. They start to get some success. They see they're getting some customer traction, and they want to do more features because they're not sure who's coming next. Like, maybe we could do 4 things at a time, or maybe we can do 3 things at a time. And I think trying to do too many things in parallel and backfilling that with adding people quickly to try to do them all is probably the most obvious mistake that I see, because usually I've arrived, particularly in these consultancies, where that process has already happened. They've quickly onboarded a bunch of people into a set of software and architecture and processes and communications that aren't really ready to scale up. And so I think for me, it's always a question. I try to present this back to stakeholders as prioritization. The priority of things is important. Once we understand that, then we can grow the engineering team at the rate that makes sense for the engineering team, and we can tackle more priorities in parallel. But we're not just going to suddenly throw a load of people at it and try and do 4 things in a row, because we're not sure which one's biggest priority.
Right. We can dig into that as well a bit later. Like, how do you know when to hire more people or when to reorganize and prioritize? So that's a good topic on its own.
Yeah, that is I mean, any one of these topics is very broad, actually. And the more you start discussing it, the more you realize all the kind of interleaved facets that
right.
kind of come into play. And often people try to simplify it down into, what are the rules that I need to follow to be successful? And the truth of the matter is, there is not a set of rules. The experiences and learning from them and not repeating the same mistakes, I think, is the number one rule.
Right.
With that focus, I think there's a related issue as well, which is keeping the expectations outside of the engineering team and the product and engineering team, if it's that type of company, about what the output is of 5 people versus 10 people, 10 people versus 20 people. Non-technical people, or people who have never worked in engineering teams, will often not really understand the concept that the type of problems that you tackle and the type of things you're building with 5 people are necessarily different to the ones that you're doing when you've got 10 or 20. And the amount of kind of technical strategy and foundational work and structure and tooling that's needed for a team that's 20 isn't the same, and particularly 20 to 50, 50 to beyond. And so, when your CEO comes and says, we're going to add 5 more people, I'm giving you budget to double the size of the engineering team, I want to see double the output, that management of that expectation and how much work needs to be put in to keep the quality and the efficiency of the team at a level isn't well understood, and it's definitely a challenge I've seen in the past.
I have a follow-up question on that, but if there's some other things you want to address, like in the main challenges, we can.
Yeah, I think the only one is maintaining, evolving your culture. It's really, really important, like how you go about your daily work in your team, and how you like to do things, and how you do it with 5 people tends to be a little different to how you might do it with 20. And how do you try to maintain that culture, but not just to doggedly hold on to it, but to evolve it in ways that make sense for a 20-person team. I think that's another one that founding members of teams sometimes struggle with, to see that changing around them, because it's a different company now than it was. Right. And yeah, it is, but it has to be.
And I guess at that point, people need to understand whether they want to stay or adapt or leave. And on the other side, for the founders to make sure they have the tough conversation with their early stage team members.
Yeah, I think that's one route. I think another route, I think that's actually usually the more common route, but I think the other route is to be open to listening to the fact that it has changed. And, is it something we've lost that we should try and regain? Or is it something that's no longer relevant to where we are now, that was very relevant at the beginning? And I think that directness and that openness is an important communication kind of culture that I like to have anyway. I like people to be very direct with me. And, I'm I'm British, so it doesn't come naturally. We're quite good at going sideways. I'm married to a Polish lady, so my wife is very direct with me. So I kind of have a good appreciation of that, and it just works so much better if people can be straightforward with each other.
Right.
And also that means, when the culture is not going to adapt and you can't, then you're no longer a good match.
In terms of the scaling from a team of 5 to 20, from 20 to 50, from 50 to 100, how do we scale the processes? You mentioned that the process is different, right, at any team size. How do we make sure we scale it properly? What's the time investment we need to do to prepare for scaling the team that much?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think the key there is, what do you do to prepare? I'm much more of the other school of thought, which is, don't get too formal too quickly. Don't try and preemptively put in processes where you're not trying to fix anything. Right? Our process is a tool to achieve a certain outcome, whatever it might be: consistency, quality, visibility. I often see, again, particularly through the consultancy engagement, so I get to see quite a few different ways in which people do it. I see these very well-documented processes. For a team of people, they have a very documented process that says, this is how we're going to do road mapping, for example, or this is how we're going to do prioritization. And when you dig in, it's usually a kind of anti-pattern, where the team has written down a process because it's almost like a mental, okay, we had this problem, we think this list of things will solve the problem. Do we all agree? Yes, we all agree. Right, so let's write it down, and now we all maintain, we'll stay to the rules. But it then allows the team to kind of switch off responsibility for the outcome, and you just trust in the process. And sometimes that works, right? If it's if the process is done at the right level, it is actually being used as a proper tool. But in some cases, it's being used as a reason to try to fix something. And when it's not working, people aren't questioning it. They're just saying, well, we followed the process, and right. That's what we agreed. And I know it sounds like a silly thing to say from the outside, but people, once you're inside that, it doesn't make sense to change it, because you've got to negotiate with all the stakeholders. Processes, when they're agreed, usually are a compromise of some kind if you're trying to fix problems and they're not clearly owned. So I think, going back, I like to try to put in the right process at the right time, and try and keep it as light as possible. I think I spent a while kind of thinking about when those things are appropriate, and actually something a guy that people probably will know, Kent Beck, one of the original he's a luminary really of software engineering and agile and kind of extreme programming, that kind of stuff. He recently came up with what he called, I think, his 3X strategy, which is, 3X is being explore, expand, and extract. And I think what the essence of what he's trying to say there is, do the right thing at the right stage of your feature, your product, your team growth, which are all kind of interrelated. And I think it's a neat way to look at it. When you're in explore phase, and you can be in explore phase with feature 1 with team 1 and feature 2 with team 2, right? They can be in different parts of the process. And then you can look at the overall product where features 1 and 2 come together and kind of make a judgment about where you are in the overall process, evolution of that. And in the explore phase, what you're trying to do is understand, like, how does this feature fit? How does it work? Is it useful? Do people interact with it properly? And you want to iterate quickly. You generally don't have so many users. So, you're not affecting so many people if you break it or you don't get it right. And you can go through those processes. So building lots of tests and lots of formality and lots of costs around that in that phase isn't really appropriate. At the point when you start to get some traction and customers are using it and everything's breaking, or it's, or you're not able to get your releases out fast enough, or you're not able to get the quality there, really you've transitioned into that expanding phase, right? You've found something that people like, and now they're jumping on it and they're starting to use it, and you're behind the curve. So then you've got to run around trying to fix things and improve things so that you can actually keep up with the demand. Usually that's when, I guess, your executives in the company are banging down the door saying, why is engineering so dysfunctional? Why have we got so many problems? And they don't usually smile too much when you tell them, well, this is a good problem to have. But actually, it's a good problem to have, at least in a product rather than a project development, because it means you're getting that traction. And then finally, so you're gradually putting in processes and approaches and tools that help you get control of that chaos during that expand phase. Then you enter the extract phase, where you're extracting value, right? Which is, and you're giving value back to your customers, and you're extracting value as a business from that. Mistakes and problems at that stage are very, very costly. So you want a tighter level of process, a tighter level of quality when you're in that phase than you did in either of the other two phases. So although that's very specific, and he came up with it when he was in Facebook, and Facebook's obviously got its own set of things that are possible or not possible, and they're very different to what most of us end up working within. I think it maps quite well, actually, to the way that you can think about processes generally within the team. So, again, go back to the Agile manifesto, right? Which people often say we work in an Agile way, but, those individuals and interactions over process and tools is exactly saying, well, actually, when we're at a certain size, we should always be trying to do this, but actually keep an eye on that, right? Because it is a guiding light for that approach. So I think there are plenty of signals that you can see when equality being an obvious one, right? Lots of bugs coming in and other things. And that's pointing at a particular problem. But ask yourself why, because I sometimes have seen, an expanding of a QA or a testing effort to try to mitigate that quality problem. Whereas my thought there is really, this is a cultural and testing problem that lives with your engineers right at the source, right? And there's plenty of ways to think about that. And actually, it's maybe cheaper or easier to hire a company to come and do your testing or build your tests, or look at saying, well, we're just going to automate everything and that will make everything better. Yeah, these are all reasonable answers in different ways, but they don't necessarily answer the question of, well, why are we having this problem? And I think those signals are not things that you should look at superficially when you're transitioning from one stage to another. You should try to ask yourself much more deeply, like, why am I having this problem? Is now the right time to solve this problem, or should I just stick a plaster over it and try to power through until we get to the next stage?
Right. That's a great point.
Yeah, it's and it's related as well to the kind of allowing the team to evolve. I'm a massive fan, regardless of whether you kind of implement Scrum as a kind of overall way of doing things. I'm a massive fan of retrospectives done and applied as a separate and individual tool to many, many things. That getting that right culture of self-accountability and self-improvement, which is what the retrospective is there to take a look at, is probably the most powerful tool that you can do to help in my experience, to help your team grow and learn. It also means you need to let people fail, right? You can't be too hard on those failures, because those failures, as much as people like myself who've seen failures in many different ways, we certainly haven't seen all of them, and that gives you your experience, right? When you've banged your head against something, you've had to think about it and then solve the problem, you remember it and you don't do it again. Whereas if someone like me comes along and says, hey, just don't do that thing, do this instead, and you don't understand why you're doing it, which is unfortunately the case sometimes, then you never really understand why you did something. You're just following rituals for the sake of it. And so that self-accountability is a really valuable attribute of a team to help you through this scaling process, because it replicates. And that's cultural as well, because as people join your team, they get used to being part of these ceremonies. They get used to seeing the way people interact in these retrospectives, not with a blame culture, but with an investigation and suggestions around self-improvement.
Right. And it's a pity that a lot of teams think of the retrospectives as a waste of time, especially like technical people and developers who are not thinking about improvement and that part of the story. They're more interested in spending time writing actual code. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are definitely places where it doesn't work so well, and I think it needs to be coached so that people can see the value that comes from it again. And it's not something we do it for a little while. It didn't. I've sometimes said it didn't really work for us. You're like, well, I don't think you're any more special than anyone else. It's just a matter of how this tool is deployed. Focusing on that and the basics as well is really important, right? No matter what size you're at, focus on those basic things. Good domain modeling, right? Good understanding of, get your data into the right shapes, even if it isn't fully formed. Take the time to really understand your domain and map your data to it, because your domain's not going to, broadly speaking, it's not going to change. Like how you surface that domain and how you interact with that data is going to change as you evolve your product to do it, but you're working in a particular area usually. So get that in the right shape in the first place, and then build the minimum that you need for today. Don't overthink what tomorrow might look like, or what we're going to be doing, and have these very large design exercises. I'm talking about teams that are 5 to 20 to 30 to 40. Don't overthink that architectural choices in some cases. Focus on good separations and API contracts and interfaces and all those things that create good, rigorous separation of concerns between the different boxes. If you do something scrappy or terrible in one of the boxes, it's okay. Just do the minimum you need to. You can come back when it becomes an important thing, and you can improve it, you can rewrite it, and the kind of scope of effect that you're going to have on the rest of your system. So don't overthink the choices. I see that quite a bit. People spend a lot of time, is it A, should we do it in version A, or using tool A or tool B, or library A or library B, or RPCs versus RESTful. These choices generally are not that difficult to undo, and they will become obvious when you get to a certain scale about which one was better than the other. So if it's not obvious, just pick one and move on. I definitely see too much rumination and too much consensus building sometimes as teams grow, because nobody's quite sure about what their boundaries are and who can make a decision. So that's definitely something around focusing on the basics that you should do. And for me, it's always been deliver good quality, whatever your agreed bar for quality is. Deliver good quality, then concentrate on doing that consistently in a repeatable way that you reasonably understand how long it's going to take you to do things. Only when you've got both those things together do you worry about the kind of efficiency. Can we do more, or can we do it better? Because sometimes you don't really get out of consistency. Consistency is good enough, actually, in many cases.
And circling back to that CEO who asks, double the team, here's the budget. How do we make sure that that's the right way to go, that we need to add more engineers to the team instead of just, prioritizing, reorganizing, all the things you mentioned before? What are some practical steps that we could take to understand which way to go?
Yeah, practical steps. I think I've got some signals again. I try not to operate in do this, do that, things that I see. You got to have stable inputs, right, to your engineering process. There's no point in scaling a team where the inputs to it from the rest of the business or the product team or others isn't understood, isn't stable, isn't scalable, right? Because you're just going to end up with a mess, because it's actually not you're going to have a lot more people building things that don't fit well together because nobody really owned them from the outside. So stable inputs to your team is definitely one thing that I'm looking at before I want to really add a lot of people. Predictable outputs, so my quality and consistency before, again, I want roughly speaking the team that I've got to be reasonably consistent and delivering and having the right approaches for the quality that's appropriate for where we are. And I think, again, judging that quality and judging the risk that you want to take with various components in your system and your architecture is different for everybody. And there are some things that you want to, if you're dealing with payments or you're dealing with medical data or something, you've got a higher level of responsibility, and so you want to up the level of quality that you've got there. Whereas if you're building small UI features behind feature flags, so you've got plenty of options to roll them out and switch them off and do other things. Maybe you don't want to test them fully and you don't want to build in all that kind of stuff to start with. So that quality level is something you agree as a team. And when you can kind of predictably do that, at least to some level, then I'm thinking, okay, that's good. We can bring people in, add them to the team, and then sort of split the team organically, or have this team that's doing it consistently as the example team, build another team with someone who's bringing those processes and approaches or practices and approaches to that team, and then scale from there. I think you need to have well-defined ownership for a couple of roles within your team. Who owns the big picture technology kind of solution, or who owns that whole picture, the whole of the problem? I think sometimes you see teams growing where they're separated and they each take a silo that belongs to them, and they're implementing sometimes some of the same, or bumping into some of the same problems, or doing some of the same things in different areas, and each reinventing the wheel. Or worse than that, you don't have someone who's kind of gluing the outputs of the teams together. And so that well-defined ownership, you need a technical ownership, then you need a kind of management coordination and process ownership, right? So who owns that? I think as you get larger, those two roles tend to partition into your staff and principal engineers or your architects taking responsibility for that big picture, and your engineering managers taking responsibility for the people, the process, the efficiency, the predictability of that, and the improvement of that process within the team. When you're a sort of small or mid-sized team, those roles still exist, and sometimes they're glued together in one or more people. But you definitely need to think, well, where am I in that stage? Do I now need, when I split this team of 20 into two groups of 10, should I hire another engineering manager? Should I prepare now to be growing this larger? Or should I say, actually, we're not going to get much larger than this. We're okay with one engineering manager, for example. I think also tools and automation, which is, for me, is really about stabilizing the fixed costs of your software development as you scale, right? You're trying to make sure that your fixed costs don't just scale in line with the number of people that you've got, and that, of course, they will increase. But automating a bunch of that means that actually you're not just like replicating with new people and having to communicate that to new people and grow. So as your team grows, so I think that's important, that you're at the right stage for the team size that you're at. And I'm going to use the metrics word, which is something that everyone aims for, not many people get to. And I think it's sometimes overthought, and you really only need a handful of those to understand, just the interface to your customers. How many customer reported bugs have you got versus ones that were found internally? It's not so much the absolute numbers, but the trend, right? If things getting better or worse as we grow, are these dials or needles kind of moving in the wrong direction in a way that doesn't look like we're in control? Should we pause, fix that problem, and then continue growing? And I don't think there's a scientific enough sometimes understanding of the effect of adding people to a team. And I think if you apply just a bit more rigor to it, the data is there, and you don't normally need to do very much more. Everyone's got a Trello or an Asana or a Jira or something that's got a lot of data in it. Can you get those high-level signals out? And put them in front of the team, put them in front of the stakeholders on a regular, like weekly basis, so that people actually know that you care about these numbers. Because that's, once you start looking at these things, people will see that their behavior affects those numbers. So it's, how do I know? I don't, and then there's a sort of balancing act, right? The budget's available, hiring takes a long time, finding good people takes a long time. So you're balancing between, am I ready to do it? And should I start the machine going so I can actually find those people in time? So yeah, it's an art, not a science, probably, in that case.
Right. Those are all great insights. And then as your team grows, so how do you go about bringing in engineering managers? Possibly at the beginning, as you mentioned, there are multiple roles done by a single person. Do you promote developers to engineering managers? Do you hire a new experienced person directly? And at what stage you do each of those? Like, what has been your experience in that area?
I think in the growth sense, I'm going to go back to the people, right? It very much depends on the people that you've managed to get actually into your team. Are these people accidentally assuming the role of engineering manager because nobody else is picking up some of the responsibilities? That's probably not a good way for it to go. If someone wants to do it and they have capabilities to do it, and then as long as the team, I think, is not too large at that point, like helping them into that role is good. Or if they have some experience and they've been holding back on it, or they're trying, going back to being an individual contributor for a while and then coming back to being an engineering manager, then of course, like help them within the team and try to give people that opportunity to do it. But I think for me, you need a good example. If you've never done it before, or you've never seen it working before, I think it's unfair to suggest that everyone needs to go through and learn all of those things. So I think if I were doing it and the team were large enough, then I would probably try to make sure I had an experienced engineering manager, and then give an opportunity for a second role, maybe with a slightly smaller team, or with a growth team, or with a more sort of stable or well-defined team, to someone who's really tackling that challenge for the first time. But give them good examples, because it's not something that comes naturally, I don't think, to most people, and you do need to learn. And it is ultimately, a people problem. Being a manager here is as much as it is understanding how those people, what people need and what makes them successful and what stops them being successful. How do you blend together that collection of people to then take on your other responsibilities as an engineering manager around, kind of coordination, with all of the different stakeholders, and, owning the predictability and the efficiency of the process. I think those are different facets of the role, and some people are good at maybe the more technical ones because they've seen them, and it's a scale up maybe from what they were doing when they were running a team, or a small team of 4 or 5, and so they want to step up and do 20. It's a lot of the people stuff that's really very different between those two roles in my experience. And then when you get to a much larger scale, of course, you're very much concentrating on owning the process of improvement of your teams and the output of the teams, in the sense of making sure they've got a good flow in, a good, well-prioritized flow in, and that they're being held accountable, holding themselves accountable, should I say, to actually delivering out based on their own estimates and their own kind of control of what the process is, but just keeping that consistency. I think another attribute is that a good engineering manager is utterly relentless, because it requires, they're really the conscience sometimes of the team when you get to a larger team, because they're the ones saying, okay, this is the process, we need to do this. Now it's the monthly, now it's the quarterly goals or OKRs or whatever you're doing, and it's that pattern of things that needs to happen all the time, and they own it, for me at least, in organizations that I've seen functioning well. So yeah, not all of us are well enough organized to want to do that. So yeah, I think there are a few different parts to it, and it's difficult sometimes when it's not working to work out, well, what should we be doing differently. And that's where I go back to the example. If you've got someone in the team who knows how to do this, who you can work with, or you can take the examples from, that makes it much easier.
Right. Let's see. So we have 2 more questions. Are there any additional things that you'd like to emphasize here, like maybe how to develop engineers to become managers, or communication between teams when such growth occurs? Some quick insights if you have them.
My manager rule of thumb is always have 2 or 3 things, 2 or 3 messages, really, that I would like both the team, the engineering team, and the stakeholders who are utilizing the engineering team, for us to be focusing on, because it's really an expression of what are we focusing on now. And wherever we go, whatever conversation we have, I'm trying to bring, not usually very consciously, but kind of subconsciously, it's an approach to try and bring things back to those points, right? It's OKRs, it's focus, it's around trying to line everyone up towards achieving certain things. And that communication, you need to trust the teams to go do the right things. You need to empower them to go do the right things, but you need, from the outside, to be giving them the right signals about what's a priority and where it is. And some of that's coming from, Jira and kind of roadmaps and other things that you might have agreed, or epics and other bits and pieces. And some of it's coming from the kind of messaging about what's important around metrics that are coming from quality, like things are dipping, or we're not delivering stuff, or those kind of things. So keep a focus on one. Don't try and fix them all, and don't just assume that because you're not talking about them, everyone will just fix them, or will fix the problems elsewhere, because they won't. You'll get 1 or 2 individuals, usually, who are shouting from the sidelines, saying, "Hey, this is not working." As an engineering manager, or as a leader in this case, you need to be listening to that and helping them either understand it's not the right time to address this, or helping them build support to go do that and enabling them to make that happen. Because when the team starts to actually correct itself, going back to the retrospectives and other things, that's when I think scaling happens more easily. Up until that point, it feels like someone's got to take charge of everything, and that by definition isn't really that scalable.
Right. When it comes to moving from monolith architecture to a microservices one, I know that you've had the challenge in the past company. What are some best practices for, like, from people perspective, again, organizing the teams? How do you tackle the issue?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's related to people, but I think it's also not related. I think a well-architected monolith has exactly the same kind of organizational separations and ownership as a microservices architecture. Okay, with a microservice architecture, usually it's distributed, so you've got other sets of problems that maybe you don't have with a monolith. So the complexity maybe goes up, and who owns that complexity, I think, is maybe important. But again, monolith, microservice, domain separations, good interfaces and contracts between the pieces, ownership around those boundaries. Conway's law, right? So the organization will build things in its own shape. So if you separate all your teams and give them all microservices to work on, but you don't provide anyone who kind of owns the bit in between, then don't expect them to work very well together, right? So there needs to be a parallel between how your team ownership and what you want as an output. And again, if you go back to the other example with like almost separate products, where each one has an authentication piece, for example, or some common functionality, and each piece builds their own authentication piece, you can kind of make them look like they're the same product, but ultimately you're logging in twice somewhere. And why? Well, because we told the teams you each need to build this thing, and they didn't really talk to each other. So, and that's because you need to put that separation. So I don't think the monolith versus microservices is really the question. A monolith, in my experience, allows you to cut corners more easily and more quietly. And there are other practices within your team that you would use to keep control of that around your kind of code reviews and kind of design approach and supervision, really from more senior, again, back to your big picture, who owns the big problem. If that's gone on well, then I think the separation is there anyway. The deployment and management, I guess, is another thing. It becomes much more complex with a microservices architecture. You've almost got another team of people who are just owning the process and the mechanics and the tooling and the tool pipelines that allow you to get change out into your architecture. And they're trying to hide a lot of the complexity from your engineering teams who are building within that, because you want them to appreciate the environment into which they're deploying and take ownership for that and own those things that are in production. But what you don't want them to do is everyone have to become an expert in every single element of deploying microservices into Kubernetes, for example. So I think there are other parts of the organization that need to have much more focus and more people, more scale in them in order to do that transition. But again, like everything, I'm a big, in all the teams that I've kind of managed or built, I like the people who are doing the changes to take responsibility for the changes, to own that change all the way through into production, including the monitoring of it when it's broken and other things. People might build tools to help you do the monitoring and put those things in place for you, but you're consuming that, because I think it aligns incentives properly for the teams, and then establishes that culture of ownership and caring. When I change a line of code, is it going to affect someone else? Because you can be sure if someone else is getting woken up, they're going to come find me the next day. Whereas sometimes an operations team is just running around trying to chase after fixing the problems, somewhat blindly in many cases, because they didn't write the code, they didn't really understand how it works. You've got to build this extra burden of communication between your building teams and your operational teams, so that they can actually do their job effectively. Better, in my experience, to have the teams own their own areas of responsibility. So your SRE or DevOps culture comes through in your infrastructure as code. They own the patterns, and then the teams own the configuration within those patterns and the deployment. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. Okay, one last question, and then we're moving to questions from the audience. You've worked at large companies as well, even though you didn't like it as much as startups. But let's see from that perspective a bit, like what are some things in Google, for example, that they do well in terms of engineering and managing engineers that you'd like to emphasize?
Yeah. First of all, I enjoyed both those companies. I just, I kind of ran my natural course there and wanted to come back and do some other things. But, to your point, what I'm about to sort of answer here really is, I think in Google in particular, OKRs, but not just OKRs, but empowered teams, which is that expression of the OKRs are setting really the outcomes and measuring how far towards the outcome you get. And you don't tell the teams how to do it. You just say, here's the outcomes we want, and then we just trust the teams to go do the thing they need to do. And they really do work like that. And so those two things together, I think, are actually what make OKRs work. So I've been in a few places where I've managed to make it work reasonably successfully, another where it was getting there, but was still quite hard work, because the pressures coming on the OKR setting were slightly incorrect, because what was happening is we were trying to really use OKRs almost like project plans or project milestones, where the teams really had to estimate essentially what it was they were putting in, so they didn't find themselves not able to deliver by the end of the quarter. And we couldn't quite break that cycle properly. So I think within Google, they really just trust the teams to get on with it and to be self-reflecting about the scores at the end of the quarter. And I think that matches nicely with the makeup of the people in the teams is different. I think the overall ambition and confidence to take risk is just much higher. There's a much higher percentage of people in the teams within Google who you come across who are prepared to do that, which means they're throwing a kind of lot of expertise at it, and they're not worried about bringing everyone along on board with it. For example, they trust each other to go do the things. So I think that ambition is certainly something that I see coming through more as a percentage in a team than outside. They also have this extremely tightly controlled engineering culture that's self-replicating, through tools, through controls. It's strange. You feel strangely free and able to do things the way you want to do them, but then you immediately bump into models of deployment or privacy councils or other things that stop you just going off in whichever direction you want, and therefore having lots of fragmentation within the teams and the approaches. So those things which are really important to control, they control, and everything else is free for you to do. And yeah, you're encouraged to take responsibility for becoming a language expert, for example, and then training other people to become language experts. And so everyone gets a badge in JavaScript style, or C or C++ or whatever the languages are of the day. And then you can then sign off on code reviews, for example. And that means you then end up managing other people's code reviews who are trying to get that certification. And so it's self-fulfilling in that sense. Hiring is another great example. It's something that I do try to do in teams that I've got, which is to build a hiring process which is owned by the teams, where all of the team is involved at some stage in the hiring process. So we end up trying to hire people that fit well with us, and we have a consistent process for doing it. And I think that's something that does translate well outside of Google.
Nice. At your point that at a larger scale, you need to be able to have everything well organized internally, like everyone to contribute to the actual scale of the company.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
If we had more time, I would like to dig more into this.
Yeah, sure.
No, go ahead.
No. Let's move to another question. Otherwise we'll not get to any of them.
Okay, so the first one with most upvotes, we have how many engineers should be on the engineering team so that the team can function efficiently, and what is the maximum number of teams that one engineer manager should lead? So how many people in the team and how many?
I don't know, a rule of thumb, I generally don't like teams to be larger than 4 or 5 plus a lead, plus a TL or some kind of lead. I think you can get away with 8 or 9 for a while, but only as a precursor to splitting them into a different grouping. Again, it depends on roles. If you are a team of 8 and that's all you have in your engineering team, and one of you is really a kind of SRE and someone's dealing with test automation or something, then maybe those numbers don't apply. So it's not an absolute rule of thumb, but yeah, sort of 4 or 5 plus a TL. I tend to think of an engineering manager because I feel that the engineering managers need to own, as you get slightly larger, they need to own the people side of things. I think there's a natural limit around 20 to 25 people in an overall org that someone can reasonably touch base with every quarter and really know what's going on and help them through that process. I think probably at a team size as well, when you get to 20, you really only need one person to help coordinate that, I think, and maybe you have 3 slightly larger teams if that's what you're doing. So I think yeah, if I had to, if you ask me for absolute numbers, and there are no absolutes, that's my experience of this. Like, you're trying to always balance between the actual people, the actual problems, and what you've got available, and try and do the best you can sometimes, even if it's not what you would like to do.
Great. And there is a question on DevOps SRE teams. So I'm guessing this is someone who worked with you in the past.
Maybe.
Should it be a separate team or part of existing engineering teams? Like, follow up on the thing that you already mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all integrated under the engineering team. I think they're different facets of the same team. They have specializations for sure, but ultimately, again, you want your SRE or your DevOps, approach to actually be available and part of everyone's lives in all of the teams. And if you separate your teams apart, their incentives aren't really aligned to go do that still. Or you've got this very narrow bandwidth of here's the process by which you throw it over the wall to a separate team. So I'm very much in the camp of wanting your SREs and your test automation embedded, if not directly in your teams, at least in a parallel fashion with your team. So you've got some kind of reasonable. You might have a DevOps lead or an SRE lead who's kind of coordinating and thinking about the overall SRE approach and the tooling and the big picture. Back to my point about who owns the big picture. And then you might have team members within the SRE teams who are assigned to support each of your individual teams into delivering things into production and helping them through that process of getting there, and then taking that feedback about what's needed back to the broader group of SREs to actually get changes made to the approach or the tools.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This one is interesting. What if the company is not aware of its rapid growth? How this may affect the engineering team?
This is a great question, actually, because I keep saying about these consultancies, that's usually the case. Actually, people haven't really realized that they've scaled up and that they should be doing something different. And they usually, at least when I've been asked to come, something's broken or something's not functioning very well. And it usually comes down to the fact that they haven't maintained this balance between the kind of roles or the focus on various different parts. They've taken their eye off the big picture to that point, and then things have got out of control, and then it takes a big concerted effort to pay down on that debt, essentially, that you've acquired. So it's it's difficult to know about what should you do, though. I mean, first of all, shout about it, right? There are signals all over the place. Usually the rate at which change goes from an idea through to production, that tends to drop off really rapidly. Quality tends to drop off, the number of bug reports or other things. Some teams solve that by not monitoring the output, which is another situation you find yourself in. You don't really know what's going on in the outside world, so you're not paying attention to it. So I think there are lots of different, I forgot what the quote was. So there's a very interesting blog that's been around for years and years and years. It's called the I Am Right hard code blog. I think it's Eric Brechner, I think, is the ex-Microsoft or Microsoft guy. And he said something about old habits. Old habits die hard, and old code pays the bills. So there's no quick fix for overcoming your legacy, I think was the essence of what he was trying to do here. So all you can do really is say, well, this is where I want to go to. Let's draw that out clearly, and then let's try to take steps each day and each change to move towards that thing. And then eventually you accept that's a long journey, right? There's no quick fix for that.
Right.
So yeah. Apologies if I've misquoted any of that, or I'm sure it's Eric Brechner.
One last question, if we have the time. How would you approach building processes and rules from scratch if you were to join a small team of 5 that doesn't have any? Or maybe you
first
don't
of all,
need
I would do as few as possible. I think it depends what stage we're in, right? Are we hiring to grow from 5 to 10 or 5 to 15? I would start thinking about, well, what are the tests we're going to do? What's the interview questions we're going to ask? And I would try to get the process around hiring kind of laid out, even if we're not ready to really scale it up, because it's an agreement among us all at that point about how do we select people, and how do we iterate on that if we find it's not selecting the right people, or it's too hard, or it's too easy. I think some basic organization is necessary, right? You need some simple tooling to understand the work that's still to be done, the work that's in progress, and the work that's complete. There are many, many good tools that are cheap and easy to do. And then when you start seeing problems, make adjustments to fix those problems. And maybe you won't see so many problems because you've got a great bunch of people who are tightly communicating in the beginning. You can get away with a lot less process.
That's great. And it's a great way to finalize this conversation today. Thank you, Andy, so much again for accepting our invite, for being part of this event. Maybe some final thoughts, or do you want to say anything to the audience?
Yeah. Look, well, first of all, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully it's been useful for people. I think the number one thing, if I were to reflect, there are no rules for this. That, you know, there are some patterns that work. There are some patterns that you can use to inform you about what you might do in the future. But try to be pragmatic. That's my approach. And don't just doggedly follow something you've done in the past, or that someone else like me or someone else says to do. Hold it in your mind as maybe why did he say that, or why does that person say this? If I don't understand, maybe I should dig in before I discard it, or before I blindly follow it. So.
Amazing. Thank you again, and thanks everyone for attending the event today. Make sure to subscribe on our YouTube channel, because this will go there in the next days. You'll get notified about it. And stay tuned for our next event. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great rest of your days.